Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the University of Winnipeg Alumni Association Alumni Perspectives Speakers Series. My name is Fred Appel. I'm a member of the University of Winnipeg Alumni Council, and I'm speaking to you today from the U of W Alumni Council satellite office in beautiful, bucolic Princeton, New Jersey. And I'm delighted to be able to uh, engage in discussion this evening with two distinguished alums of the U of W who have recently retired from very distinguished careers in public service in Canada, complementary careers, but quite different as well. And I will be introducing them in turn in just a moment. Before I do so, I do want to extend a few words of thanks to some of the people who have made this event possible. Brian Hobson, the current president of the University of Winnipeg Alumni Council, Judith Newman, the immediate past president of the Alumni Council. I want to thank the two of them for their support. Also, Helen Cholakis, the manager of Alumni Affairs at the University of Winnipeg, and our friend Evan, who is a tiny bit under the weather this evening, but still soldiering through, who works for Media Studies at the University of Winnipeg, who is our technical host for this evening. And thank you very much, Evan. Just one more thing before we get started with our discussion this evening. I just want to give a plug for a couple of other webinars that we have scheduled for later this season in this same series featuring other distinguished alums. In the month of January, on Thursday, January the 18th, we are featuring a discussion with two alums who work as university professors in academia in the humanities. Karen Wiseman is a professor of English literature at the University of Toronto. And her friend and fellow alum, Warren Breckman, is a professor of history at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. They'll be speaking about careers in higher education, careers in academia, and the future of the liberal arts in the academy today. So I hope you'll join us for that. That's Thursday, January the 18th, 2024. And then in February, on Thursday, February the 22nd, also in the evening at 8 p.m., we will have a younger group of alums. I'll be hosting a roundtable discussion with some recent recipients of a very distinguished fellowship or scholarship awarded by McGill University called the McCall McBain Scholarship. Several very interesting recent graduates of the University of Winnipeg have won this very competitive and highly coveted scholarship for people interested in leadership positions in the public sphere, in the private sector. They're studying now at McGill University. Several of those alums are Indigenous students, and we very much look forward to speaking to them about their nascent career paths. So that's coming up on Thursday, February the 22nd, 2024. Well, all right. So all that being said, let's turn to our discussion at hand. Let me introduce very briefly the friends who will be speaking with me this evening for the next hour. Gabriella Egenhofer is speaking to us from Victoria, British Columbia, and she received her BA at the University of Winnipeg in 1987. She worked in the public service for 25 years, retired in 2015. She worked mostly in Yellowknife for the government of the Northwest Territories. She spent most of her public service career negotiating Aboriginal rights agreements and serving as Deputy Minister of Aboriginal and Intergovernmental Affairs, and later as Deputy Minister of Education, Culture, and Development. Joining us is also Beate Schiffer, and she received her BA from the University of Winnipeg in 1985. She also has a Master's of Public Administration, which she received in 1989. She retired even more recently in 2020, after a long career of public service in the government of Canada. She started as a customs officer at the Halifax Airport and Harbor, and she became a policy executive, briefing deputy ministers and ministers. Her last position was with Indigenous Services Canada as special advisor to the Assistant Deputy Minister of Strategic Policy and Partnerships. So, Beata and Gabby, thank you very much for coming and joining me this evening.
Thanks, Fred.
Thanks for having me. Yes,
so,
thanks, Fred.
Oh, no, I believe the two of you have known each other for quite some time. And I just wanted to establish what the relationship was. Did you meet at the University of Winnipeg as students, or did you meet shortly after your respective graduations? Who would like to start? It doesn't matter, really.
Beata, do you remember?
I think it was at the University of Winnipeg that we met, because we would take classes. I think we were just sort of within a year of each other. And, I don't remember exactly when I first met you, Gabi, but it was quite noticeable because we kind of come from a similar background, both having come from Germany to the university. And it was obviously is a small university, so which is actually one of the things that I find really attractive about the University of Winnipeg. So that's, I think, Gabi, when we met, and then we kind of were both in political science, public admin, and so there was a bit of overlap that way too.
That's right. Yeah. She was way smarter than I was, but I caught up eventually.
So you met, excuse me, you met in some of the same courses, is that right?
Yeah. I don't know if we took the same courses. I think it was mostly in the cafeteria, Gabi.
Oh, that too. Or in the Union Center across from the University of Winnipeg. I don't know if that's still there, but it used to be, and you could get a jug of beer for a couple of dollars, and a lot of students would go across the street and debate life.
Yes,
well,
that's right.
I don't recall Beata from that time, but I graduated around the same time, and I do remember Gabi very well, but I don't remember her in connection with political science courses. My first memory of Gabi, I think, was in the theater program. And I think you had a small role in the chorus of a production of Arthur Miller's The Crucible. Do you remember that, Gabi?
Yes, I do. Yes. Yeah, I do. That was a great theater program, actually. Yeah.
It was. It really was. And I remember, and you, one of your roommates, you shared an apartment with someone who was involved as an actor, a student actor in the theater program, Anne
Berriger, that's right.
Anne Berriger, that's right.
That's right, yeah.
But let me ask you both, if you can cast your mind back to the courses that you took at the University of Winnipeg. Was there one particular course that stands out in your memory, or one professor who was particularly inspiring, someone who might even have nudged you in the direction of public service that you eventually took? This is a free-for-all. Either of you can jump in.
Well, Beata, you want to go ahead? Go ahead.
Sure. Like in my case, actually, if I think about it, I can't really narrow it down to one, because I remember very clearly the first course I took at the University of Winnipeg was with Don Bailey, and that was in history. And he was a fabulous, fabulous prof. I mean, he was just a straight shooter, really enjoyed him. I don't think any of the profs that I remember from UW nudged me into public service per se, but there was Alan Mills, who was, I probably took most of the courses that I took at UW from Alan Mills. The other person, there are two more I need to mention. One is Claudia Wright, and she was so inspiring. Took imperialism with her, took revolution with her. And it was just that kind of time where really you kind of were ready to just about go on the street kind of thing. And then it was Carl Ridd, who I also very fondly remember. And then lastly, Jack Thiessen. Not that I took courses from Jack Thiessen, but he would just crack me up. Like, he was quite the character. Yes. Lots of good profs, but none that really pushed any particular.
I see.
Career. Not that I remember.
What about you? What about you, Gabi?
It's funny because it's many of the same people, but Claudia Wright for sure. She was an energy in that university, and I think, you know, looking back, she shook up the University of Winnipeg power structure as well as a woman as a woman professor and getting into the administration. I remember it's not that long ago that it was difficult for women, even in the academic world, to bang through that glass ceiling. She was certainly one of them. The other one who is very close to my heart is Thelma Oliver. She used to teach political thought, and I loved her. And I think I just wanted to be like her when I grow up, and she was fantastic. One stands out for me, though, in an odd way, and that was Tim Ball. I remember all the people in the humanities would take Tim Ball's physical geography. That was their one science credit they had to take. And he was a fantastic professor in physical geography, but decades later, I heard him on the radio being a climate change denier, which was so interesting because I thought, God, are you kidding me? So I don't know what happened to him, but yeah, the University of Winnipeg had some fantastic professors. My favorite and somebody who really did change my trajectory was John Loxley, but he was at the University of Manitoba, but he was affiliated with the University of Winnipeg through Paul Thomas with the public administration program.
I see.
I would have mentioned Paul Thomas, but he was at U of M, but yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
A very important person in my life.
Yeah.
I'm so glad that Gabi mentioned Thelma Oliver. I also took a political theory course with her, and she was really tough. And I was a little bit of an arrogant whelp, and you know, she really cured me of my complacency and marked me down heavily if I didn't work genuinely hard and didn't really push myself. And she was just a really interesting person. And Claudia Wright, I was terrified of her.
Yeah, everybody was.
Simply terrified. In my first year as an 18-year-old, I mean, she had an aura about her, and she accepted no BS. And I think she went into administration at the U of W after I graduated there and became, you know, quite important in the echelon. She was just a very tough professor when I was there, when the two of you were there as well. Let me ask you both, were there any false starts to your respective career trajectories? I mean, were both of you maybe toying with the idea of doing something else before moving into public service? Were either of you tempted by the idea, for example, of law school? Were either of you tempted by social work? Were either of you tempted to move into a science direction? Just curious.
Well, prior to going to the University of Winnipeg, I actually did law at University of Bonn. So that's why I think I got into political science, because it was sort of the closest thing, given that you have common law in Manitoba anyway. But yeah, the only thing I would say is I was probably more drawn to academia than to public service. And for me, it was more the circumstance of moving from Winnipeg to Ottawa and then doing consulting work, and the federal government was the biggest employer. And so it was, I think, a characteristic for my entire career. I would say it was a totally accidental career. So I slid into it and it worked out really well. But I didn't have sort of that sense of, you know, I want to join the public service.
Beata, how old were you when you emigrated from Germany to Canada?
I was 21.
You were 21 years old. Okay, so your first experience at the University of Winnipeg was, you were a little bit older than some of the other people in your class, I imagine.
Yes, yeah. There weren't as many people my age in those classes, for sure. And then, you know, very quickly too, there weren't people with children either. So like, yeah, on both those counts, I would say I was probably a bit of an outlier right from the start.
Okay, you had a child at that time when you emigrated at the age of 21, or
no, not at that time, but
okay,
before I graduated, I think I had 2, and then by the time I had my master's, I had 3.
Okay, so you emigrated with a partner.
Nope.
No? Okay.
No.
All right. It was just that occurred later. Okay.
Yes, well, actually, I don't know how relevant this is, but I was actually on a student exchange program from Germany to Canada,
Okay.
met this man in Winnipeg, who's from Winnipeg, and then came back. I know it's a very sappy story, but that's what it is.
Excellent. Gabi, what about you? I mean, were you tempted by several other paths before you chose public service?
Absolutely, I was a total scatterbrain. I went
Yeah.
from going into, theater. I was going to pursue that, and then I chose, no, I don't want to do that, and I wanted to change the world. How do you do that? And I had no idea in how to tackle it. And really, at the end of the day, ran out of money and needed to find a job. And there was a job posting with the government of the Northwest Territories. And that's kind of how I fell into the civil service. I certainly didn't go through university thinking I will be a public servant at some point in my career. I chose the public administration program only so I could work under Professor John Loxley and do a thesis with him.
Okay.
And that was my motivator to going into the program. So nothing was planned, really. It really wasn't.
Now, I know that both of you had experience working in the Manitoba legislature as interns, and I wonder how you came to apply to that program and where that fit in the trajectory. I mean, if you could just tell me a little bit about that internship program. What was it about? What attracted you to it? Was it did it happen at the same time as the master's program in public administration, or did the master's program occur after the internship experience?
Wow, that's an interesting question. I don't remember how I stumbled upon the internship program. It probably was advertised on campus, but I would highly recommend if it's still in operation. It was a fabulous way for a year to work for a political party. In my case, it was the NDP, but it was an interesting time because the NDP had just lost the election to Gary Filmon and the Conservatives. So it gave me an opportunity to basically see the NDP from being in power to becoming opposition, and preparing briefs and doing work for Elijah Harper, who later rocked Canada.
Of course, yes, I remember.
So it was a fabulous time and a great experience to work for really interesting folks, and seeing how I would describe it, how the inside of the sausage making when you're actually in the assembly. It was very interesting. And it
Right.
sort of whet my appetite to get closer to the political system.
So when you're a young intern working in the Manitoba legislature, you are attached to one of the political parties, and you're working with the MLAs in that political party, and you're helping them by developing policy papers, position papers, and so on. And you're not a full-time student and a part-time intern. This was a full-time job at the time. Is that right?
Yeah,
Yes,
it's a full-time. Yeah, it's a full-time position. Yeah, and I think you were maybe the third cohort. It had just started. I don't think the legislative internship program had been in existence for long. I thought we were maybe the second cohort. I worked for the Progressive Conservatives at the time, who were in opposition because the NDP was still in power at that time. And yes, you would just basically be assigned to the caucus and be used by the caucus for research purposes, for policy papers, for whatever needed to be done. And as Gabi said, it was a very interesting, and I think to some extent very eye-opening experience to see MLAs, how they conduct themselves, and also how that part of the process, the legislative process, actually works. It was really good, and we had a very good clerk of the House, Bings, who actually ended up in the Northwest Territories, and he was very instrumental in giving us some guidance too on how it all works. And I would say lastly, it was Professor Thomas, I'm pretty sure, that at the time suggested that that might be a really good complementary sort of experience. You had to apply, and they did have enough applications. So, I mean, it was great, but you just really got introduced to all these aspects of the legislative system. It was fabulous.
So it's interesting. Gabi worked on the NDP side of the aisle after they had been defeated in a provincial election, and you, Beata, worked for the Conservatives when they were in opposition, which is very interesting. And I assume, Beata, that you were assigned to the Conservative side, not necessarily because you were a Conservative voter at the time. This was just a program assignment, and you had to put aside your particular prejudices, your particular inclinations, and you had to do the best job you could given who you were assigned to. Is that right?
Yes, that's basically a very important lesson of the legislative, internship program. Although I do think it's probably unlike the public service, still trying to instill in you, in this case, more conservative ambitions, right? Because I mean, in that context, I think you are very partisan, not so much like in the public service, because you're working for that opposition party, and they're looking for some dirt on the government, and so they ask you to dig that up. Well, as a public servant, I don't think you would do that necessarily in the same way. So I think there were some important differences that I would say are not transferable to the public. So I think it is a much more politicized environment overall, and the public service is not that. At least not at the level in that sense.
That is so interesting. You both experienced an internship program that had, as part of its inner workings, partisanship. You were each assigned to a political team, a partisan political team. But then you developed public service careers that did not necessarily involve attachment to a political team. You were you came to work for a ministry or a department that served whichever party was in power at the time. Were either of you tempted to want to pursue a much more partisan career, to become a sort of a political appointee, or someone whose career involved getting the party you favored elected and staying in power? I mean, were either of you tempted by the partisanship that you tasted in the internship program?
Not I. I think actually, even if, at the time, and probably still today, ideologically, I probably are, or was at the time, more left-leaning than right-leaning, so I wouldn't have been a bad fit to be working for the NDP. But what I did experience was that even the parties who you felt close to sink to a whole new depth in trying to win points in the assembly when it comes to question period and so forth, that actually did the opposite for me. I had absolutely no interest to pursue working for a political party after that. It was a great experience. I loved it, but I learned what I didn't like, and it wasn't deep enough policy work that I was starting to get interested in. It was sort of, working towards headlines, at least in the small, unimportant positions that we were in. But that was my experience.
Yeah. Beata, does that resonate with you as well?
Oh, totally, very much so. And again, that doesn't mean that there isn't a role for that kind of dynamic in a democracy. I do think it's important. But again, as I say, if you were just looking to find something on the other party or on individuals of the other party, that's not really sort of what I'm interested in. But there's a role for this dynamic for sure. But I really enjoy the neutrality of the public service. That, to me, governance, a rules-based sort of society, to me, that's very important. And those are the kind of things that I'm very passionate about.
Well, it's a very timely matter. I mean, we're here in the United States, we're faced with an election that will be coming up next year, in which one of the major candidates has pledged to destroy the foundations of a nonpartisan, neutral public service. So I think the value of such an institution is scarcely appreciated until it's threatened. So it sounds like both of you had a valuable experience in the legislative internship program, but there was also some disillusionment with the partisan nature of the work that you did. So let me ask you, the two of you now, about your journey from that program into public service. So, Gabby, you mentioned your move to the Northwest Territories. You had a 2-year-old, you had a 3-month-old. You put them in the car. You drove many hours. Was that right after your internship program? And how did you think to make the leap with small children and to go somewhere that presumably you had no experience of prior?
Well, that's a question that I can't answer why I did what I did. But, I was reflecting on an earlier question when we prepared for this webinar. What advice would you give to people who are in university now in working for the public service and how to get a job? And I think the advice that I was provided was good at the time, and that is think outside your comfort level. You want a job in the civil service, maybe you need to step out and go into more rural and remote communities. And, don't just think of, the place that you are going to university as the place of work.
Yes.
And so I think that still holds true. You have to be prepared, I think, to go. I mean, would I have, in retrospect, thought that I would go as far north as I did? Probably not, but it was the best experience that I've ever had. I've lived in Yellowknife longer than anywhere else. It was in one stint. It was fantastic. It was a great place to cut your teeth as a civil servant. It was very unusual because there are no partisan politics. It's a consensus style government. You are amongst Aboriginal First Nations. The power structure is quite different. You are in a place that has been colonized, and it, still feels all of the warts and horrible experiences that are, shaping the present. And it was a great experience. I wouldn't trade it for the world, but would I've had the same experience if I had stayed down south? I don't know, it's hard to say, but that move to the north was great. It was a job in the housing corporation as a policy analyst. I happened to do my master's thesis on housing for single parent families who are Aboriginal. So I was very interested in Aboriginal politics and the plight of Aboriginal people in Canada. And yes, there was an opportunity to put my money where my mouth is, in a way, and see what I could do. And it was fantastic work. And I'm glad I did what I did.
You applied for that job when you were still in Winnipeg, I assume. It was a job in NWT. How did the interview process go? Did you drive all the way up there on spec for a job interview? Was it a phone interview? There was no Zoom back then. How did it work?
It was actually quite interesting because it was an ad in the Globe and Mail, which my then husband cut out and said, "Hey, check this out, policy analyst for the NWT Housing Corporation." I applied. I got an interview actually in one of the hotels in Winnipeg because their HR team flew down to Winnipeg. And while I was in labor not while I was in labor, but while I was in the hospital giving birth to my daughter, I was studying the Dene Métis land claim. because I was preparing for the interview, and it was, I think, 3 days after I'd given birth. I was in the hotel with their HR team applying for the job, and I think they thought, she's got some guts. She is doing this, and I got the job. Yeah. And then
Yeah.
I just drove up. I mean, you basically, you take the map and head north.
Yeah, no Google Maps back then.
Nope.
Beata, what was your path after the Manitoba internship? It did not involve a drive to a remote northern community. What happened with you?
No, so my husband was a public servant with the federal government and worked for immigration, and got a transfer after I finished my thesis in '89, and was transferred to Ottawa. So then, being here, I thought I'll start at Carleton University, do a PhD. That didn't quite pan out, so I did some consulting work, and then applied on what at the time was part of the Public Service 2000 initiatives that was launched under Brian Mulroney, to try to regenerate the public service, knowing that there was this mass exodus. It was called the Management Trainee Program, and it was a fairly competitive program, a pan-Canadian program. And so I applied on that one, and you had to have a master's degree, but language was at that point not a barrier in terms of you didn't have to be bilingual to get into the program, but you had to be committed to becoming bilingual. And so I applied and I got in, and this Management Trainee Program was like a 5-year program with a regional assignment, and that's where the assignment with Canada Customs came in Halifax. And again, one of the lessons learned, don't sign a mobility waiver if you don't think you are mobile. Because I figured I'll sign this mobility waiver and they'll never make 6 people move, but no, they did. So it's interesting. And that program was fabulous. It was a very good experience. It got you into different departments, in different functions. Every year you would have to be in a different job of increasing responsibility. And it was a very well thought out and managed program, in my opinion. It was very good.
So just to be clear, the disability waiver that you just spoke of is an agreement that you sign as a trainee or as a sort of an entry-level civil servant, agreeing to be posted wherever the government of Canada decides to post you. Is that correct?
It was in the context of this program, because part of the program at the time was that you had to have headquarters experience, you needed regional experience, and there was an Indigenous exposure component to it. So it was a very structured, well thought out program. So you could start in a region, you would have to move to headquarters for 1 year. So it's not with every public service job, but again, the public service, federal government obviously is in all provinces. So if one is interested in a career in the public service, it's one of the things to think about. It's also very much an advantage because it's one of the few employers where you can kind of, get exposure in a number of different geographic locations and different types of jobs in different departments.
Now, Beata, at the time you entered into that program, you were married and you had moved out to Ottawa because your partner, your husband, had a public service job, yes? So when you began to be posted outside of the capital region, did that cause difficulties, with your husband's career, or was he able to arrange a transfer in order to be with you?
Well, it's interesting, Fred, because it did cause some issues within the family that I think, I had a very supportive husband, and by that time we had 4 kids, but I think as much as that regional assignment was very enriching for me and my career, it was stagnating for his career and for his ability to progress. So he did some remote work. This was sort of before the time, but that was more common. And he felt that was very difficult for him to do so. So I think it was at his expense, in a sense, that I was able to do this regional assignment.
Okay, it is difficult being in a professional couple. Yeah, I mean, sometimes compromises have to be made, and he stepped up and made a certain sacrifice, and perhaps at a later stage in the career, you also, made a sacrifice too. Did it work sort of both ways, in the course?
Well, I think the fact that we moved to Ottawa, right? I mean, that was
Yeah,
sort of again, you're a team, and so sometimes one team member needs to
sure.
do something, and you. So I think for us in our relationship, it worked well, but I wouldn't say that it was without discussions and at times some disappointment for the other person or even for the children,
Sure.
knowing that you're in a place for 14 months, you're not making the same connections, you don't expend the same effort in fitting in, right? If you know.
Yes.
So I think it's hard on the family, or it can
Yes.
be. I think at this point, I would say everybody feels that it was a very enriching experience and that we were really lucky to have had that opportunity.
Yes. I mean, this raises the issue of work-life balance and how one can balance a career with a stable and a happy and a fulfilling family life that involves children. And I wonder, I'd like to invite each of you to share your experiences, perhaps positive and not so positive, about you know the ease or the struggles with which you were able to strive for a work-life balance, especially in those early years when you had small children. I don't know, Gabi, did you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm just making some notes here.
Yeah.
It is absolutely difficult to for one of the partners, and it's usually the women, in my experience, my generation, that feel predominantly responsible to make sure the kids are cared for, and you also want to pursue a career. And even if it's not a steep career path, I mean, working away from home, and no matter what job you are, and you don't get proper childcare, is difficult, and it's a strain on the family. And that's why it's so important to have affordable and quality childcare if you want both partners in a family unit to work. And
Mhm.
in today's economy, it's hard to conceive of just being able to afford a normal lifestyle with one person working. Most of the people that I know, both partners will have to work in order to do that. So absolutely, that's a challenge. I think the North was great in the sense that the work-life balance was really honored. And I remember when there was tragedy in families, or people needed, for whatever reason, to be with their families, that was usually by our ministers. Usually that was understood and not questioned. So my experience is only with the government of the Northwest Territories, but I never felt that I was asked to make a decision that I wasn't feeling comfortable with. If I needed to be away from the office, I could do that. I'm not sure that that same latitude is afforded to a younger generation in the civil service. I mean, I see my daughter who is in the civil service. It's more difficult. I think it seems almost more competitive, right?
Isn't that interesting? Were you reporting, Gabi, to mostly men, or were there women you were reporting to as well in NWT government?
Not until my later years, I was reporting to women, and that was, made a difference because they've traveled that same road as I have. But interestingly enough, most of my ministers that I had a direct reporting relationship were Aboriginal. And I think the cultural characteristics of even those Aboriginal men were quite different in terms of seeing family as a priority. That wasn't an issue. I mean, I really, in retrospect, I could call my minister up and say, I cannot make that trip. My son is in the hospital or whatever. And it was like understood, no questions asked.
I wonder, Beata, how that contrasts with your experience when you had smaller children.
Yeah, I think in the federal government, my experience was a little different. And maybe it's just the size of the machine. I mean, it's a huge organization. So there wasn't, I would say there were policies in place that on paper would suggest that there were options available to parents, like leave with income averaging or a alternative kind of work week, like compressed work week. If you were to avail yourself of that, I would say that there was certainly in the early years an implication that you don't take your job very seriously. And so it kind of curbed your career trajectory if you were asking for it. So it was available, it was on paper, but it wasn't something that was done. And I think it's over the course of my career, I would say I did see that change. But I also personally experienced by asking for it that you kind of get cut. The implication is you're not serious about your job. You're obviously more serious about other things, which, again, as an employer, I always feel the employer as an organization has certain rights and expectations, and that's fine. I just felt at times early on, if you have those policies, then it would be nice if one could avail themselves of them without having.
I see. Beata, I wonder if that attitude that you experienced in the federal government bureaucracy had to do with reporting almost exclusively to men, or I mean, if there are women you were reporting to, did they also buy into a very family unfriendly philosophy in that era?
I would say early on, yes, it was primarily men in those positions. It wasn't out of a hostility in a sense. I think it was just their expectations of what you did as a public servant working, you're being compensated. And yes, we have this policy, but no, actually it's going to use those. So I think it was almost more like a mindset. I'm not trying to excuse it, but I don't want to come. Yes. I don't want to suggest that the public service didn't allow it, but there was sort of this culture there that, if you're serious about climbing the ladder, you just don't do that.
Yes. Understood. I wanted to get back to the question of, Indigenous involvement in the public sector, in government. I mean, it seems that this was an important and essential part of Gabi's career from the beginning, given the composition of the NWT government and the composition of the society. And so clearly, Gabi was dealing with those issues right from the start. What about you, Beata? I mean, later in your career, you worked for Indigenous Services Canada. Did you, become acquainted with these issues later on in your career than Gabi, I wonder?
Yes, definitely much later. Like, in fact, it was sort of a pre-retirement assignment at Indigenous Services Canada. The only other exposure I had that was more intense was through Health Canada, because Health Canada, of course, has a fiduciary responsibility for First Nations. And so Indigenous people, and we have the First Nations Inuit Health Branch within Health Canada, which is the biggest healthcare provider in the country and has the biggest health insurance program in the country. So it was only through that that I sort of came into the Indigenous or onto the Indigenous file. I would say, 80% of my career was much more focused on other departments like Industry Canada, Revenue Canada. Like, they were much more sort of crunchy in a way, economically focused.
Yes.
So I don't have the same depth and experience, obviously, that Gabi, you would have in perspective.
Gabi, did you notice an evolution in the way these issues were, discussed and debated between the provinces and the federal government in the course of your career, in terms of Indigenous self-government?
Yes and no. I think at the intergovernmental table, Indigenous issues always were sort of, okay, we've established our agenda. Politically correct thing to do is to talk about Aboriginal issues. and it was a free-for-all. It wasn't done, I don't think, very earnestly. It wasn't until later where the Council of the Federation was established by the premiers of the provinces and territories, where they, led, I think, the provincial territorial tables by saying we should meet with Aboriginal leaders prior to the provincial territorial conversations. And so there's, that was positive. The difficulty in Canada, of course, is that we have so many Aboriginal nations, some of whom now have treaty protected Aboriginal self-government rights. They are governments in their own right. They're third orders of government. And they're not the ones that would come to the table with the other premiers. It is like the AFN or the Métis Nation Council and so forth. Well, they are not the Aboriginal governments. So the alternative, so it's difficult because you've got the wrong players at the table with the premiers. But the alternative is impossible. You cannot get the Aboriginal government leadership at a table because you would have hundreds of First Nations leaders around the table. So, I see there was definitely a will to do the right thing, but the complexity is such that it's just difficult to make earnest progress when you have national Aboriginal organizations at the table, and their organizations are not governments. And so I witnessed some of the tension when the Aboriginal leaders in the territory who have negotiated modern treaties with constitutionally protected self-government rights saying, why is the regional chief from Ottawa sitting at the table with 13 premiers talking about child welfare legislation? They have no business speaking on our behalf. And that's accurate, but the alternative is not possible. So I think that's a dilemma in this country, how to resolve that and how to crack that nut. It's not easy. And every jurisdiction is different in terms of this, the status of the Indigenous governments.
If I understand correctly, it's the decentralized nature of Indigenous societies and governments and the multiplicity of them that make it so difficult, to develop respectful, direct communication and cooperation. There's just so many players and so many actors, I guess.
That's correct. And that's what makes it difficult. There is obviously a role for the National Aboriginal Organization, and that is to raise awareness, to push for changes in a whole raft of areas. But when it comes to government relations, it's difficult to have those organizations at the table. And I think, maybe a bit of bitterness, but I think that's where the federal government really was asleep at the wheel. There was not a lot of federal leadership to say, we need to find better ways to engage Aboriginal leaders of this country with the provincial and territorial and federal leaders. It didn't happen then, and I don't see it happening now. I mean, the prime minister has a hard enough time to drag himself out of the office to meet with the provincial premiers and territorial premiers, let alone Aboriginal leaders. So I think that's, we're not a very healthy federation in many ways, because we don't.
What do you reckon, Beata?
Well, a couple of things. One is, the premiers have never made it very attractive for any prime minister to drag themselves out of the office, because it's usually just sort of a session to be beaten up. You've got 12 against 1, and it's not very attractive. But I do think on the reconciliation file, and this is not sort of a partisan statement, but my sense is that there is tremendous change underfoot within the federal government, where I think there's an effort to permeate the thought and filter of reconciliation through everything we do. And that's no longer limited to Indian and Northern Affairs or Indigenous Services or whatever we call that department, but it is government-wide to kind of have that perspective. And I think, again, when you talk about an enterprise that's 300,000 employees, it takes time to change the mindset. And I think the file of Indigenous issues is so complex. And I think whenever you're in the federal government, that's one of the incredible challenges and rewarding challenges. You have all the perspective that you need to kind of broker. There isn't one interest because it's pan-national. There are always competing interests, and the federal government, the role of the public servant within that is to kind of articulate and bring those all to the table so the politicians can, be informed. Yes. And it's a very complex environment to be in. And so I'm not dismissing what you're saying, Gal, but I do think there's this context of complexity.
So I want to come back to what Gabi said earlier when she spoke of her time as a student at the University of Winnipeg, and she said she wanted to change the world. That was what she wanted, and it was it was an exciting time. It was a politicized student body. We were all demonstrating and signing petitions, and it was. There were anti-nuke protests in the streets, and it was the end of the Cold War, and there was a lot of idealism. Now, as you think back on your careers as public servants, I wonder, I suppose that there is a stereotype of the public servant. It's not one that I personally hold or share, but it's in the either. The public servant is someone who is sort of very conservative or uncreative, or someone who is just doing what they're told and they're just pushing paper, and what they do is kind of drudgery or boring or so on. And I'm assuming that this was not reflective of your experience in the course of your careers. And I wonder what you would say to people who have been told that this is what the life of a public servant is, and what you might say to persuade them otherwise.
Well, if I can kick it off, I think in hindsight, the way to affect change, I mean, you don't change the world. I think you learned that very quickly. But to affect positive change, I really do think you need to work in a decision-making role in the civil service. So what I mean to say by that is, if you are a policy analyst like I was, there is not much change you're affecting. You can do a great job, but I quickly realized that in order to bring issues to light which I thought had been neglected, or to really rock the boat, you really need to climb the ladder. And it sounds really trite and horrible, but it was true in my case. I mean, you get people that frustrate you because they don't want full disclosure of all the issues when you write up briefing notes, or stifled innovation, because a lot of the people I worked with when I was in the civil service were white old men. That's what it was. Even in amongst a largely Aboriginal community, it was white old men with really old and stale ideas. And the world was fine from where they sat. So it required no changing. And you can hit your head against that till you are unconscious. Or you decide, okay, I want my bum to be in one of those seats to open the windows really and let some fresh air in. And that's exactly what I was striving to do. And then you can really affect change when you become a decision maker, and you work for a minister who gives you instructions and directions that you embrace and you want to implement. So yeah, I would find it very frustrating to spend 30 years as a policy analyst in any government, because I don't, for some people that's great, but in answer to your question, if you want to change things, you're not going to change it being an analyst in any government. I don't care which one it is. I think you need to get up there.
To be clear, you pivoted from being policy analyst to what exactly?
I was a policy analyst, then I was a chief negotiator, and we had quite a bit of leeway because we were amongst some of the first people negotiating Aboriginal rights agreements, self-government agreements in the country. But then I became a director of self-government negotiations, and from there, I think I was an assistant deputy minister, and then associate deputy minister, and then I made it to deputy minister.
Well, yeah, that was quite an ascent. Beata, any thoughts about your trajectory?
Well, in terms of, I didn't go into the public service with any particular goal of changing something per se. So I guess for me, it's much more incremental, which happens to be more consistent with a large federal public service. I think if you pace yourself and if you are realistic in your expectations, if you want to change the world, I think you need to go to the political side. If you want to make incremental change with a value set that supports the society and those that are in power, then I think you can actually do that at every level. So I would suggest even being a customs officer, how you conduct yourself and what you do does impact how people will perceive the public service and the government of Canada. So I think to me, no matter where you are, and I don't mean to be sort of Koreana, but I do think it is your conduct and the values that you bring to your work and the ethics that I think change your team, change the people you eventually manage, change the people you report to as well. And they certainly had an influence on me that way too. So I think, yeah, if you don't have aspirations to change something right away, then I think the government of Canada can be a very, very positive opportunity to contribute to society.
So I'm going to begin to wrap up our discussion, Gabby and Beata, because well, it's dinner time over in Victoria, and Gabby needs to get moving and to connect with her family. So before we do sign off, I do want to invite each of you in turn to offer any advice you may wish to offer to a recent alum of UW who is thinking of moving in the direction of public service. Is there anything that you did that you think ought to be avoided by the younger generation, or something that you did that worked that you would like to see younger people lean into?
Well, I would say be open to all sorts of possibilities of working in rural and remote communities. Cast your mind to not just a provincial and territorial or federal governments. Municipal governments, I think, are very exciting places to work. A colleague of mine was a deputy for a long time and then became a city manager, and loved her time there because you deal with a lot of concrete bread and butter issues. So that's what I would say. Go look to work for an Aboriginal government. There's lots of opportunity out there, and yeah, have an open mind.
Excellent. Beata, yeah.
I would certainly echo that. I think being open in who you work with, what you will be working on, I think is really important. And bring yourself and your education and your values, bring yourself to that job. That would be my advice. And again, Canada is a big country, and in particular the federal government, there are many opportunities. And there's so many things the government actually does at all levels that a lot of citizens aren't even aware of. So there are incredible opportunities, whether you're a professional, whether you're a scientist, whether you're a tradesperson, whether it doesn't really matter. There are lots of opportunities. So yeah, just be open and enjoy the ride, because it's interesting to me that both of us, Gabi, you and I would describe myself as an accidental public servant, as an accidental evaluator. I hadn't, had this in my sort of brain as a map, and it worked out really well. I enjoyed it very much, and I would highly recommend it. It's very rich and rewarding.
I think The Accidental Public Servant would be a great title for a memoir, don't you?
I agree. It's really good.
Maybe one of you should write it.
Of course,
Too much work.
You could workshop it together. No, you're having too much fun in your garden, Gabi, and with your grandchildren,
Exactly.
I know. All right, I think that's an excellent place to leave it. We don't have a ton of questions from the webinar attendees. We do have a comment from an attendee who's another member of the University of Winnipeg Alumni Council, Dorothy Young, who writes about Paul Thomas, your professor. It's a small world. Paul Thomas, was on Dorothy's PhD committee at the University of Manitoba, a straight shooter. Although he is retired now, he is still active in politics and often writes opinion pieces in the Winnipeg Free Press. So there you go. Still very engaged. So Gabi and Beata, thank you so much for giving me so much of your time to speak to me about your careers. And I want to thank everyone who has attended this webinar on behalf of the University of Winnipeg Alumni Council. I'll just make another plug for a couple of webinars coming up early next year, January the 18th. That's a Thursday, 2024. We have two university professors, distinguished alums of the University of Winnipeg, one at the University of Toronto, Karen Wiseman in the English department, one at the University of Pennsylvania, Warren Breckman in the history department. They'll be speaking about the liberal arts education they received at the University of Winnipeg, their career trajectories in academia, and the future of the liberal arts in this country and in North America. And on Thursday, February the 22nd, we're going to have several recent exciting graduates of the University of Winnipeg who are now recipients and holders of McGill University McCall McBain scholarships, and they will be speaking about their lives in Montreal studying at McGill University. So I hope you'll join us for that as well. So thank you again, Beata and Gabi, and thank you, Evan, for sticking it out, in spite of being under the weather. I really appreciate it. And have a very pleasant evening, everyone. And take care.
Fred. Thank you for organizing it.
It's been a great pleasure.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.